All very much for coming. It was a close run thing. The traffic was such that Amartya just made it, but here we are. And thank you so much, Amartya, for being with us. This is the Eva Colony Memorial Lecture. I'm Nick Stern. I'm the IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the LSE. I'm also privileged to be one of the trustees of the Eva Colony Memorial Trust. And I did have the privilege of meeting Eva many years ago, and it was a great privilege. We have with us Professor Lea Ypi, and excuse me if the pronunciation, shall I do it again? That's okay? Okay. And of course, our dear friend, Professor Amartya Sen. Now, Lea is a professor of political theory here at the London School of Economics, enormously distinguished. I promise not to go into long CVs, but her book, Free Coming of Age at the End of History, won the Ondaatje Prize, translated into 35 languages, would you believe? And I think a couple of years ago, El País named Lea one of the 6 most important thinkers of our time, and quite right too. So that's it, by the way. I mean, I could go on there, but okay. Amartya Sen is Professor of Economics and Philosophy, the Thomas Lamont University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University. Wonderfully distinguished, and you all know his books, so I'm not going to go through them, but they have enormously influenced me in my own work, whether it's development and freedom, poverty and famine, and so on, and particularly the idea of justice, which Amartya and I discussed. I think it was here 6 or 7 years ago. You all know his distinction. That's one of the reasons you're here, so I don't have to go very long about it. And of course, Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998. So the subject, I hope I've got it right, the idea of moral socialism, is the subject of the lecture. This event is being recorded and watched online and will become, we trust, a podcast. There will be a chance to put questions, and I'll do it the usual way, with collecting 3 questions within the room and then 3 questions online. And I hope we get chance for 2 or 3 rounds of questions. When it comes to the questions, please give your name and institution. This is, of course, in honor of the wonderful Eva Colony. And amongst us, Mary Kaldor knew Eva particularly well. Mary Kaldor is Professor of Global Governance at the London School of Economics. And Mary, could I ask you to say a few words? Is it all right to use a lectern, Mary?
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Nick. And I'm here really to welcome you all on behalf of the Eva Colony Trust. And I'm going to start by saying something about Eva, something about the Trust, and something about Lea, very briefly, because we want to hear Lea. So Eva Colony, she was an economist. She studied inequality. I got to know her when I went to India immediately after I finished university, and I always felt she was my first grown-up friend. And we had really amazing conversations about family, politics. She was a very committed socialist. She worked all her life against social injustice. She was committed to Europe. And I think something to be told about her is the fact that her father, Eugenio Colonna, who was killed by Mussolini, was, along with her stepfather, Altiero Spinelli, who most of you will have heard of, or many of you will, were the authors of the Ventatoni Manifesto, which was the manifesto written in 1953 by prisoners on the island of Ventatoni, which became the document of the European resistance. It was calling for a united socialist Europe. And what else do I want to say about Eva? I think the main thing to say is that she was incredibly beautiful. And she looked absolutely wonderful in a sari, which is very difficult for Europeans to do. So the trust was set up by Amartya in 1985, and the trust includes her former colleagues at City University, her family, and I'm really pleased that Indrani, her daughter, is here today. That's wonderful. And her friends, of whom I'm one, and Nick is another. And what the trust does, which is really great, is its basic thing it does is to provide bursaries for poor students and refugees at City University who don't have enough money to complete their studies. So it's very much in the tradition of Eva's work. But it also puts on really good lectures. And the last lecture was by Arundhati Roy, quite a long time ago. We haven't had many lectures since. And now I'm really pleased that we've got Lea. I think Eva would have loved Lea. She's got just the same politics. She calls herself a Kantian Marxist. She's a very democratic socialist, and you're going to hear all about what her politics are. So I don't really need to say more, except that if you haven't read her book, Free, it's really fascinating because it explores the idea of freedom from the perspective of someone being brought up in a communist totalitarian country and then experiencing the effects of neoliberalism. And so anyway, it's beautifully written and a wonderful read. And I know that she's just about to bring out a new book, which is about her grandmother. Her grandmother is the heroine, actually, of her book, Free, because her grandmother is all about how you can be free in all kinds of situations. It's all about moral agency. But anyway, I leave it to you to read it. So I'm really delighted that Lea's here to give us the Eva Coloni lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. I also meant to add at the beginning that it's the International Inequalities Institute that has been organizing this on behalf of the Eva Coloni Trust, and its head, Chico Ferreira, is here. Thank you very much, Chico, and all the people involved on your side for that. So Lea, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted and honored and moved to be here tonight to hold this lecture in honor of this wonderful human being, Eva Coloni, whose critical spirit, I am sure, will be with us as I introduce you to this idea that has been perplexing me and intriguing me for some time, the idea of moral socialism. And maybe the first thing to do before trying to explain what I think that idea consists on is to try and motivate the question behind it, to say why it's a good question at all. So why moral socialism? To which my first very quick semi-humorous reply will be, well, would you rather have the immoral version? And then you might say, actually, no. No socialism at all, just more capitalism, please. What's wrong with that? Well, so this is a first quick answer. Moral capitalism is an oxymoron. We are much more likely to make progress with the morality of socialism than with the morality of capitalism. Why is that? Well, the answer is in the root of the word. both words, actually. The root of the word capitalism is capital, and the root of the word socialism is social, from the Latin socius, which means friend. Capitalism is a relationship based on the exchange of things, and socialism is a relationship based on the recognition of people. So my first attempt to answer this question of why not moral capitalism is that actually morality applies much more straightforwardly to the relationship between people than to the relationship between things. And actually, there is something fundamentally problematic about a society that bases the recognition of people on their relationship to things, as is the case of capitalist societies. So let me go back to the question. What is moral socialism? And now I'll say something about the socialism part and then something about the moral part. What is socialism? There is an old joke that says that socialism is the painful transition from capitalism to capitalism. And actually, I don't think that joke gives a very historically inaccurate definition. But actually, I would say that surely, even if the aim of socialism is just to make capitalism a little bit better, that's kind of sufficient to make us interested in it. But I will go with a more philosophical answer, which I hope to elaborate more as I go on. I'll say that socialism is the set of social and political relations that, given current circumstances, aspires to the full possible realization of freedom of agency. And by freedom of agency, I mean the freedom to set and to pursue moral goals. And by current circumstances, I mean the circumstances of global capitalism that we're all familiar with. Now, if you are in any doubt on whether we live in a capitalist world, just pull out your phone and look at the little icons that you see on the first thing that you'll see on it, through which we communicate with each other, we order food, we read books, we listen to music, we move around, we organize our travels, and all the wonderful things that we do with these little flashing icons on our phone. And consider that behind every little flashing icon, there is a massive private company. And actually behind the physical container of all these little icons, there's also another private company. So capitalism is the system that organizes our lives and that is characterized by the private ownership of those little flashing icons. And another old-fashioned way of saying that is that it's a private ownership of the means of production. And a system that is incentivized by the pursuit of profit. So far, I think, so uncontroversial. Now, let me take this one step further and ask, if socialism aspires to the fullest realization of human freedom, isn't socialism inherently moral by definition? So, supposing it's a good thing to aspire to socialism, should we also aspire to moral socialism? And isn't the word moral here kind of redundant, because we already implied by saying that we're aspiring to freedom? Now, that morality was irrelevant to socialism seems to have actually been the majority view of socialists for much of the past century. And the reason, so this traditional socialist said, is that the question of moral socialism is kind of misleading. It's even intentionally misleading. It's even bordering on sabotage. And the question of moral socialism was actually traditionally thought to distract, or even worse, to kind of undermine the real goals of socialism. To add morality to the word socialism was considered at best redundant, at worst perverse. And as one famous socialist, Leon Trotsky, famously put it, the people who add morality to the word socialism, I quote, exude twice the amount of their moral sweat. Similar to people who perspire twice, simply out of fear. Now, Trotsky wrote these sentences in an article which bears this kind of self-explanatory title of Their Moral and Ours. And so the time thought Trotsky had come to abandon both the kind of moralism of religion and the idealism of the Enlightenment. And so he said philosophical idealism, you know, it had its time, it's played a role, it's brought us here, it helped us secularize morality, it freed us from religious sanction. However, he says, again, quote, having torn from heaven moral philosophy had to find earthly roots. And to discover these roots, Trotsky thought, was the task of historical materialism. Now, if there was a hostile group in this audience, which I'm sure there isn't, but if there was, for the sake of argument, and if that group had to come up with a counter title to this lecture tonight, the counter title would be exactly the one as the one that Trotsky gives to his article, Their Moral and Ours. And that's exactly the opposite of what I'm going to argue today, which is that morality is universal and plays a fundamental role in social critique. And so to find the earthly roots to moral philosophy, as Trotsky is asking us, is in fact not to abandon the moral critique of capitalism, but to show the specific ways in which it undermines freedom. Now, Trotsky wanted, among other things, to kind of discredit this idea that there can ever be a moral standpoint that is independent from the material reality of conflict, or more specifically, class conflict, from which the aims of socialist action are deduced. And so socialism, he says, quote, derives a rule of conduct from class struggle, which, as he says, class struggle is, again, quote, the law of laws. The end, Trotsky says, flows from the historical movement. And now I'm done with Trotsky. But the question is, what is this law of laws? And so how can it avoid turning the god of religion into this kind of god of history? And the answer is actually in Trotsky's own biography. He wrote this article entitled Their Moral and Ours in February 1938, which was only a few weeks before the Anschluss in what would then become the first act of territorial aggression committed by Nazi Germany that paved the way to the Second World War. Now, around the same time, a French-educated Albanian lawyer had written down an article published in the first issue of a progressive Albanian magazine that was called Both IRA in Albania and the New World. So this author studied and lived in Paris, where he was involved in the Popular Front, and as it happens, briefly overlapped with Trotsky during Trotsky's time in exile in France. And I don't think they ever met, but as some of you know, I'm from Albania, and I mention this not just because it's cool to be from Albania, which I assure you it is, and I recommend it to everyone, but because it actually matters to the argument that I want to make. So this Albanian article was published in 1936, and it was entitled, a little bit similar to Trotsky's argument, Lessons from History. And I'm now going to read a couple of sentences from this article, which I promise you I won't read in Albanian. I quote, history is an accurate mirror in every step of social evolution. It shows us that intellectuals has often played a productive role in the search for how to improve political and economic conditions, but more importantly, how to improve our ability to think about them. He goes on to say, consider the example of the relentless struggle for progress that Enlightenment thinkers mounted against religious authorities, which was continued with the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille, which was a symbol of the past. Their ideas, so these Enlightenment ideas, based on reason, this author says, reflected nothing other than the aspirations of the masses. They showed that education, culture, Enlightenment unites us with them, with the masses, against those who oppress them and benefit from injustice. Now, the author of this article has a number of things in common with Trotsky. They were both socialists, writing from a position of solidarity with the people, but they weren't exactly of the people, neither peasants nor workers, because both of them came from wealthy landowning elites. So in Trotsky's case, it was Jewish elites. In this Albanian case, it was Muslim elites, which is to say that in both of their cases, the reason for at least this prima facie identification with the masses were moral reasons. They had nothing to do with their class positions. Their class interests, their class position would have suggested the opposite. And so there's this commitment to socialism that doesn't come up of this immediate class belonging. And both, as you will have noticed in their articles, acknowledge the centrality of history in connection to political events. But there is a slightly different implication to how they read the relationship between moral principles on the one hand and politics on the other. So unlike Trotsky, where moral principles are derived from what he considers the laws of history, in this author, the principles of the Enlightenment are based on what he calls philosophical reasoning. And they're crucial to improve our ability to reflect on historical events and to advance critiques of society. And so reason, or more specifically critical reason, is our anchor to engaging with social reality. So who is this author? This author is actually my grandfather. And almost exactly 10 years after publishing this article in 1936, at the age of 33, he was arrested by the communist government that had come to power in Albania at the end of World War II. He was charged with agitation and propaganda and collaboration with British officers, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. If you do something very fashionable right now, which is to go to Albania as a tourist, and then do something very unfashionable for Albanians, which is to take the train, very, very slow train, you will cross a bridge going down south, which is called the Bona Bridge, which was built by my grandfather and his inmates during their time in prison. So my grandfather, like Trotsky, were both victims of Stalinism. And actually, unlike Trotsky, he never had any Bolshevik sympathies. And also, unlike Trotsky, he also actually never had any faith in these laws of history, in the name of which he was imprisoned. The irony is more on Trotsky, because Trotsky was killed on those same laws. But like Trotsky, he remained a socialist, and more specifically a social democrat, even after he came out of prison. And he was actually something that the social democrats of today would struggle to recognize as one of theirs, because he always thought all his life that democracy and capitalism were not compatible, even though he lived in communist Albania. And I only mention this story here because my reflection on socialism and my effort to recover this moral root of the critique of capitalism grows out of exactly this really complicated relationship with the so-called real existing socialisms of the past century, including the theories that inspired the governments which eventually then collapsed. And the other reason is that in a lot of post-communist countries, the socialist tradition tends to be viewed with great suspicion because of these historical experiences and because of this really difficult legacy of the end of the Cold War, where people mostly think that only history matters, their history, and the philosophy, the Marxist philosophy, the critique of capitalism has all been discredited. And on the other hand, in much of Western Europe, you have the exact opposite. Only the philosophy matters, these great ideas that criticize capitalism, but the history is always the history of some people out there who had these experiences and somehow failed because they didn't know how to get it right. And I think it's this inability to both engage with the failure of state socialism and to reimagine alternatives, as well as this tendency to relegate the failures of state socialism to this historical episode that doesn't really concern the mainstream, is actually what reduced and is responsible for a lot of the misfortunes that we now experience, including the crisis of the left and the rise of the right. So, as I said, my effort to think about what moral socialism is grows out of this personal unease with both, but I don't think it's just a personal unease, it's also generational unease, and in some ways it's also contextual unease with both of these traditions. On the one hand, this tradition, let's call it of immoral socialism, so the tradition of their moral and ours, which in some ways was pursued at this really high cost over the 20th century. And on the other hand, the failure by capitalist societies, whom we are constantly willing to exonerate in the name of political realism, which is just another way of saying in the name of the absence of a credible, both intellectual and political alternative, which basically condemns us to thinking that capitalism is the only system we have, and so we better stick to it. And this attitude to capitalism, I hate to break it to you, but is not what the dissidents of Eastern Europe were fighting about when they were going after state socialism and socialist rule. Even though, and this is what I see in part as what this project tries to do, which is to recover their legacy, they were quickly co-opted into the neoliberal transformation of former socialist societies when their initial aspirations had been very, very different. They were aspirations to freedom and to democratize their societies. So that's the failure of the left in Eastern Europe. Now, the Western left has gone through a parallel collapse. Once it was liberated in the 90s by the association to state socialism, it greeted the emergence of this new world order marked by opportunities for prosperity and respect for the rule of law and so on. But what that meant was that democratic politics stopped being about alternatives to society, about systemic alternatives, because the only scope for change was seen to be within the parameters of the existing legal and political framework. And so its only aspiration on this Western social democratic left was to tame capitalism rather than to articulate an alternative to it. And so the left basically turned from a project of global social emancipation to one of national reform through the rule of law, to the liberal project. And it became a domestic civic liberal project rather than an international socialist one. And in that process, what it did, it surrendered politics to policy. It turned to administration, it turned to responsible government, it turned to thinking about how to share the benefits of global capitalist markets that nobody ever then after dared to challenge. Now, we know now that the free market didn't perform as well as was expected. Social inequalities increased, regional divides remained significant, and the various cycles of financial crisis continued to erode the traditional welfare state, as you had these austerity programs that were often implemented by the left, by this left, that were continuing to take hold. So the third way, which was this project of combining democracy and capitalism through domestic legal and political reform, ends up in a bit of a shortcut and ends up being discredited. And yet, even though that project seems to also have been discredited, it's really hard to see where alternatives to the existing status quo emerge from, other than the ones that are articulated by the far right and which are increasingly becoming mainstream. So guess who declared about 7 years ago that he was a Leninist? Donald Trump's then chief political strategist, so Steve Bannon. And that is hardly a moral alternative to the status quo, either in the Leninist version or in the Bannonist version. So when I say that there's no moral alternative to the status quo, I don't mean to say that there are no fundamental critiques of capitalism in universities, among social movements, sometimes even in political parties. And so you have post-colonial theory, you have environmental justice activists, you have human rights movement, all of which are really important and inform public debate, but all of which do so from a position of fragmentation. Because they have abandoned, all of them, this alternative to come up with a unified answer to the system. And that's why I think, and that's where I'm now going to go into a little bit, what we need is the return to a kind of spirit of the Enlightenment, to the systematic spirit of the Enlightenment, and to both its universalism, which has now become a swear word among the left, and to its critical spirit. So that's where my effort now becomes a little bit historical and a little bit philosophical. It's historical because actually no set of ideas, not even the moral socialist idea, comes out in a vacuum. And so part of my effort here is to recover a lost tradition, which returns us to a path that was not taken and that returns us to all these forbidden socialisms that existed in the past as well, but which were marginalized and squeezed out by this titanic clash between capitalism and state socialism in the 20th century. And it's philosophical because no historical adaptation can be just a historical recovery. It always needs to be rethought for the times and for the challenges of the present. So what I'm going to do in what is left is to sketch out the elements of this alternative approach. And as you'll see in a minute, this alternative emerges out of an engagement both with the idealism of the Enlightenment, in particular the Kantian critique of reason, and with the Marxist-inspired critique of capitalist societies. And as I said, there are historical precedents to this effort. So Key figures in Germany include people like Hermann Cohen, Karl Vorlander, Hans Staudinger. Also, Edward Bernstein, the original founder of social democracy, was in this vein. Bernstein never thought that democracy and capitalism were compatible, as most of his followers and the people who cite him say now. And a lot of these debates, were conducted on the pages of the Neue Zeit, which was the journal of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. So in 1896, German philosopher Hermann Cohen, who I have just mentioned, declared, and I quote, that the true founder of German socialism is Kant, not Marx. And that socialism is based on ethical idealism. So Cohen's argument can be summarized in very simple sentences. The Kantian categorical imperative in one of its formulations, which is to treat human beings always as ends in themselves and never only as means, is incompatible with capitalist practices on the basis of which people are turned into means of profit. And then there's other Kantian Marxists. So in the Austrian realm, in the Austrian school, people like Max Adler and Otto Bauer, for whom this synthesis of idealism and materialism isn't so much a direct application of Kant's ethics to the justification of socialism, but actually what's important about it is the way it enables us to address skepticism about values in contemporary societies and about the role of morality. So as Otto Bauer, this Austro-Marxist, puts it in an essay that he wrote in 1906 on Marxism and ethics, if we regard, quote, if we regard the social question no longer as a scientific issue, as this traditional Marxist did, but as one involving a practical stance, it becomes a moral question. The driving force, Bauer says, of class struggle is not only class interest, but also class ideology. And that class ideology arises out of a certain stance that you take to the world. And it's here, he thought, with regard to when you think about the question of socialism, not just as a question of science, but as a question of life. And if you're looking for an answer to the undecided voter, to the waverer who says, should I be a socialist or should I not be a socialist? That's where the Kantian practical stance helps you. And that's where the Kantian method. So I'm just going to say something why he thought that the Kantian method is useful. But before we do that, and before we kind of go on why the Kantian method is useful, we need to do one last thing, which is to reject historical materialism in its most famous formulation. The most famous formulation is found in the introduction to the German ideology, in the famous paragraphs that outline the core of historical materialism. So this is now Marx. In direct contrast to German philosophy, Kant and Hegel to some extent, says Marx, which, quote, which descends from heaven to earth, historical materialism ascends from earth to heaven. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. So this is the problem, this is the core of this divide. What Marx is saying is philosophy is just another form of ideology. And this is the challenge that we have to reject. Is philosophy just another form of ideology, as this quote suggests? Well, that depends on what you mean by philosophy. You will have to bear with me for 1.5 minutes talking about the critique of pure reason. Towards the end of the critique of pure reason, in the section called the architectonic of pure reason, that is devoted to the unity of philosophical system, Kant argues that philosophy is the sum total of all our efforts to philosophize. He doesn't speak about the material conditions under which these efforts to philosophize emerge, but the further elaboration has really important implications for this rejection of historical materialism that I'm about to offer. Kant distinguishes between two ways of understanding philosophical efforts as they have historically unfolded. What he calls the scholastic concept of philosophy, the Schulbegriff, and what he calls the world concept of philosophy, the Weltbegriff. So according to this first understanding of philosophy, Kant says, philosophy is thought of as the system of all philosophical cognition and aims to achieve the perfection of knowledge. It's the ideal of scientific completion, concerned with the organization of cognitions within science and the taxonomy of different sciences within one overarching system. But now Kant says he's not happy with this definition. He says this is a Schulbegriff, this is a scholastic philosophy, this is a scholastic concept of philosophy. But he says, look, there's a better concept of philosophy. There's a richer understanding of what we do when we do philosophy. And there's a world concept of philosophy, which he defines as the science of the relation of all cognitions to the essential ends of human reason. So in other words, and I'll be done with the first critique in a minute, on the first definition of philosophy, Kant says, the representatives of scholastic philosophy are just the technicians of reason. He calls them Vernunftkünstler. So they have no other ambition but complete knowledge without asking what is the value of knowledge. So they deploy rationality in this instrumental way without considering what is the end of knowledge. What is the purpose of science? What is the purpose of technological progress? Why are we doing all these things with each other? And so although their cognitions in the end help us formulate rules of understanding, Kant says, they are technicians of reason rather than legislators. And so Kant then follows on with an example of Socrates, and he says that following Socrates, that the better definition for these kinds of scholastic philosophers is to say that they are not real philosophers, but what they are is lovers of doxa, of opinions. So they're not lovers of wisdom, they're lovers of opinion. And the philodox, Kant says, is related to the philosopher in the same way in which, he says, wait for it, the businessman is related to the legislator. So the question of perfect knowledge can't be separated from the question of the value of knowledge. And so basically what this paragraph suggests that I've pulled out, there's a lot more, but this is enough, I think, for tonight, from the first critique. Kant is kind of agreeing with Marx here that some ways of doing philosophy are ideological, and they are just a reproduction of the status quo. But in defending this kind of different understanding of philosophy, this world understanding of philosophy as a sort of systematic endeavor that is guided by our moral reason, by our rational vocation, by this other way of thinking about the human, he's basically delivering a critique of technocratic reason. And that's not all there is. Kant says there's another way of viewing the philosopher, which is a teacher in the ideal. And so where he says in the second form, he says, okay, philosopher is a teacher in the ideal. Where do we find the philosopher as a teacher in the ideal? And surprisingly, the author of the Critique of Pure Reason says that the philosopher in that way we find nowhere. Why? Because in that case, philosophy is a political project. It's not just a project of systematizing and clarifying and explaining and just making progress for its own sake, but rather thinking about the connection to these human ends of reason. And in that sense, the Enlightenment is not just an intellectual pursuit, it's a political pursuit. And in the most famous definition, the one that says, according to Kant, that the Enlightenment is the project of emergence of human beings from their own self-incurred minority, understood as the kind of inability to make use of one's own understanding without authority, this is where you really see how the Enlightenment is a political project. And to pursue this project, you can't rely on positive law as you know it. We can't rely on standards that are given that we just inherit without questioning critically. You can't rely on the bounds of family or of community or of gender, or of race or class, because to take any of that for granted is to take for granted some arbitrary factor without scrutinizing it based on this model of reason. Now, it's become really commonplace to kind of dismiss these remarks as if they're either overly abstract or they're not reliable as a political guide. And Kant, however, offers you three simple maxims that are a very good test whenever you're thinking about, is a law a good law or a bad law? Am I doing something right or am I doing something wrong? These are the maxims of what he calls the enlightened thinking. So the first one is to think for oneself. The second one is to think putting yourself in the place of everyone else. And the third one is to always think consistently. And he also thought that the project of the Enlightenment could be advanced through this public use of reason, which is delivered by these maxims of the Enlightenment, which is very separate from the private use of reason, the use that you make of reason in any specific professional role as an academic or a doctor or a lawyer or a business person. Because while the latter is premised on this acceptance of authority as it comes to you through the social role that you occupy and with the recognition of the particular obligations of that role, the first one requires working to ensure that even though we can't avoid adopting identities, we can always also step out reflectively out of these identities and kind of question them from a moral perspective and think about their implications. Now, I don't think Marxists, and I haven't heard any Marxists, have good answers to what's the problem here. I don't think they have reason to object to this project. It seems to me that what socialist theory provides is a more specific and a more complex account of the particular structures that stand in the way of the project of the Enlightenment in this way. And I think they're right in that. So they point out how ideology or alienation or false consciousness are obstacles to what we can achieve from this moral perspective. And also explains, again, the socialist tradition and the socialist critique explains why it's so hard to recover a public point of view, because the tendency is always to privatize the public. Just think about the oligarchization of democratic politics. Just think about the people behind all these different icons that you have on the phone and their tendency to prevent democratic debate, to prevent the public from actually really having a say in the way they privatize public life. So socialism, I think, gives a name to that problem. And in this sense, it's not the project of the philosopher kings that rule the world. It's rather the political project of all citizens becoming philosophers. So both Kant and Marx recognize that human dignity rests in our capacity for rational self-determination and this ability that we have to act according to principles that we can want to be universal laws. Think about these maxims of the Enlightenment. But the further contribution of the socialist tradition is to explain that capitalism ultimately systematically undermines this capacity by forcing us into social relations that make humans treat each other just as means and never as ends in themselves. It isolates us, it atomizes us, it prevents the kind of genuine moral engagement with others that Kant saw as essential to practical reason and as the core of this political project of the Enlightenment, which is the recognition that my freedom depends on your freedom and that the conditions of a meaningful exercise of moral agency, of a meaningful realization of freedom, these conditions are not just individual conditions, they are inherently intersubjective. So that's why this method is essential, because moral socialism is grounded on a universal epistemic standpoint, which then requires turning into a critique of global political institutions. And what the Marxist tradition does is it integrates this moral critique with an analysis of globalization that explains that the main agents of conflict in a globalized world are not states fighting for power, are not groups with different religions or different cultural positions. It's groups with different interests because of their socioeconomic position. And the scrutiny of the moral validity of these interests is essential and has to depend on universal standards. Neither of them justifies itself. So this is where we go full circle on freedom. And these are really my last few words. Liberalism traditionally tried to limit the power of the state or of religious authorities or of institutions that threaten individual freedom. In its efforts to disperse these authorities, it generated its own distinctive structures and its own set of fears and its own kind of unfreedom. Now, the problem is that capitalist power structures, unlike the power exercised by socialist states, are anonymized and they're impersonal. And so they're spontaneous, they're not planned. And the psychological attitudes that are consolidated by these kinds of power structures are selfishness and indifference rather than outright aggression, which is why it's really hard to challenge these power structures. But that doesn't mean that the threat to freedom that this liberal capitalism poses is any less concerning than the threat to freedom, the alternative, and less pervasive than the kind of choices that it promises to fulfill. I think, if anything, it's more pernicious, because where power is connected to money, where it's spontaneous, where it's anonymized, it's actually really, really hard to fight. And so in some ways, my thought here is the exact, and I will leave you with this thought, with my thought, which is the exact opposite of Hayek. A spontaneous order, like the capitalist market, not just in its reality, but also as an ideal, because Hayek was also an idealist. He didn't think that we had capitalism. He thought capitalism was some future affair, the state of affairs that we need to kind of contribute. This kind of spontaneous order, not just in reality, but as an ideal, rather than enabling freedom, risks completely destroying it. And that's what I will leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lea. It was absolute tour de force and so much to go away thinking about. The next contribution is from Amartya, some reflections on what we've just heard. So many of the ideas of public discussion and public reasoning that you've championed for so long. So Amartya, please share your thoughts with us. It's just before 6 and we have to close at 6:30. So, if about 10 minutes would work, Amartya, then we have about 20 minutes for questions. But we all want to hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, to express as strongly as possible how much I enjoyed the brilliant ideas that Lea had presented before. And you asked me about my reflection. I'm quite anxious to hear the reflection of everybody else here on that. But I will take the 10 minutes and make some comments, if I may.
Please.
I think the basic issue that Lea has presented to us is very central, not just about how to define socialism, capitalism, what's the path of moral, but it's basically whether to think one's commitment to be to certain institutions of certain basic ideas. And I think at one stage, Lea asked the question, what were they fighting for? They were not fighting for some institutions. And nowhere do you see that, and I feel very delighted that Lea brought in Marx's heterodoxy on that subject a number of times. Because he moved from very different traditions. If I ask a student who discusses the issue of not everything being labor, that environment and land has a very big place, but the answer is Critique of Gotha Program by Karl Marx, where he begins by that, saying that the Gotha Program makes a big mistake in saying, so while all value is labor, it's not. Similarly, in Capital, Volume 1, when he asked the question, 1860, what's interesting thing happening in the world? And he said, well, I thought that you talk about the 1848 Paris Commune and something. Not so. The only interesting thing that happened in the world was the American Civil War. He would later describe capitalism as a kind of wage slavery, but he did think the difference between slavery and wage slavery was extraordinarily big. So the institutions are always adapting to the ideas. And this is a point where I might take a minute of my time to comment that this whole issue about ideas and material conditions was, in what sense was Marx a materialist? Well, what he says again and again, that ideas affect material conditions and material conditions affect ideas. There is a duality in that. Now, why is it that it's dialectical materialism with which we associate him? When I was an undergraduate, one of my great friends, teachers, and writers, Eric Hofslong, wrote an article in a journal that became defunct almost as soon as it's born, called Marxist Quarterly. 1955, he had an essay called Where Are British Historians Going? Argument was that Marx thought that there was a dual relationship, but all the people, powerful people around him, were saying again and again how ideas are very important. So he had to say the material conditions are also very important, affecting ideas. And in that context, he said, if you see a kind of vulgar materialism, as he used the word, by somebody like Nemea, saying that you cannot understand Burke's criticism of Warren Hastings, except in terms of his losing money, nothing to do with the fact that he was very upset about what was the East India Company was doing, would be a great mistake. The role of the Marxists, up from their faith, will be to point out how ideas are very important. And that's where you have to begin. Now, I think we have arrived at a point about socialism and capitalism, that what Lea is doing is exactly what needs to be done. And there's also if our commitment is to certain basic ideas, I'd like Lea's mentioning the distinction between two types of philosophers. And when he was, she didn't mention it, but when he was quoting all human beings are philosophers, that's of course Antonio Gramsci also. That's how he begins his discussion. So I think if our commitment is to ideas, we learn things again and again. And in terms of Lea's thoughts presented here, I would bring out something where the London School of Economics is involved. It's the work of people like Titmuss, like Hammond, that taught the world that you could have a economy that had the benefits of a market system and yet have a rationing system, have price control. And he didn't find it out, but if you look back, you can see that the period in which Britain had the highest, the decade over which the highest expansion of life expectancy occurred in Britain was the war years. Not the victims of war, but the beginning of the decade, end of the decade. What happened? What happened was rationing, was control. And in fact, suddenly cases of when Britain had the lowest per capita food availability that it ever had, its life expectancy jumped up. Cases of undernutrition fell, and cases of severe undernutrition disappeared. So I think if our loyalty is to the ideas, the institutions have to adapt ourselves. And if you're a moral socialist in the sense that there's certain types of, where she began by mentioning why there's a real distinction between moral socialism and moral capitalism. Capitalism was born with an institutional, the term was an institutional term right from the beginning. There's a wonderful book that's coming out, not come out yet, by one of my colleagues called Sven Becker, called Capitalism. And you find out how it came actually in the beginning of capitalism was around Aden in the Gulf. And that's the trade that was going on between the European part and the Asian part. And that was always an institutional issue. Socialism has not been that. It came on, it may have a religious connection too, as a non-religious, severely non-religious person. I ought to say that it's not religiosity that you see, but related to quite many ideas. And I still think I've had to give a sermon once in my life in Trinity College, my college, and I gave it on Luke, on the Good Samaritan story, and Jesus is arguing with a lawyer, and he describes what is going on, and then Jesus asked the question that when this wounded man wakes up, who would he think was his neighbor? Who would he have reason to think is his neighbor? He said, obviously, a Samaritan. And but Jesus doesn't say it, but he says, essentially, I rest my case. That is, it doesn't have to be the guy next door. It has to be a belief. Now, this is a religious idea in the sense that there's Luke, and also I can quote from Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and all the others. Now, I think the big thing that I would say there is doing here, I hope this will be a book someday, and it's to take us in that direction. There's one small thing I would leave a question for her to think about. It's not so much about Marx, it's about Kant. Not so much what Kant believes were. There are two problems. One, to me, an astonishing problem, is his racism about Africans. And they shared something with Hugh, he shared something with Hegel. They had no difficulty accepting Chinese and even Indian and Japanese in being in the same group, but African. And I think as one of the most neglected character of 18th century philosophy is Mary Wollstonecraft. And as she points out that, and that's a Marxist idea also, if you can say, namely whether Marx wasn't yet born, that it's the class ethos was such. People standardly having slaves. You have to explain how come you treat some people like this. How is that possible? Now, Kant failed that test, totally, and described that Africans were basically inferior. Now that, I think the two great philosophers I can think of who never could be accused of them are Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Never you find that. But the others, including Hegel, it could be that. The other thing on which is more technical is that Kant, like many other social contract theorists of that time, beginning with Hobbes, assumed that when people get together in this kind of a primordial equal place, they would arrive at one moral solution. I think as a pluralist, and here again I'm with Marx, that there are different appeals. And I think the chances that everyone will agree is unlikely. And you have to accommodate the possibility of disagreement. And how do you do that? And that's very central to what has been the successes initially of socialism, as well as the limits of the way state captured socialism was practiced, basically going entirely against this agreement. And I think I would regard this to be one of the central features. If you think of, I take one more minute, the critical Gotha program to which I refer. What is it about? And it says that when the German Workers' Party, which is the Gotha program, is the program, says that everyone should be paid according to their work. The question that Marx asked, what about guys who are not so good at work? What about ill people? What about people with large families? And that's where the question about need comes in. And much of that critique is about there's a real conflict there. And sure, if you work hard, there is a case for you to get more than that. It is not only Marx who is talking about it. People who say landlord lives, as Mark Bloch does, landlord lives on the labor of serfs. Now, that is a work point of view critique, but there is a need point of view critique. The Titmuss-Hammond argument, the beginning of the National Health Service, and whether we think of it as a socialist structure within a market economy or a socialist idea in which the market economy is accepted as in its efficient role is the kind of question that Lea would raise, and we have to. But I think there are enormous issues about the plurality concern that Marx had. People don't have, I'm becoming too much of a Marxist, I guess, which I've never been and never will be, because I also have disagreement. But on the other hand, among the most interesting things to read is Marx on on free speech against censorship. No one was as firmly against every kind of censorship as young Karl Marx. So all these things, and yeah, I can't tell you how absolutely delighted I am. I'm very sad, if I may make a personal note. Can't think of someone who would have enjoyed your lecture more than my late wife, Eva Coloni, after whom this lecture is, and on whom Mary Calder spoke. And I'm very sad that she's not able to hear you. She would have absolutely loved it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amartya. Enormously enlightening and thoughtful, as always. So many of us here are students of yours in one way or another, and that reminded us why we've been so privileged. Well, Amartya emphasized disagreement. I think, Amartya, you'd agree that disagreement is both an end and a means. Yeah. And LSE is not the place where we dwell on agreement. So I do hope that we'll it's going to have to be a very short Q&A because we do have to finish at 6:30. So I'm going to take 3 questions. I know it's tempting to make your questions long, particularly on this issue, but can I plead with you to make your questions short, because we want to get enough people asking questions and we want to give time for answers. So please, could you mention who you are very quickly and then go on to your very quick question. Please, lady in the front, please.
At the International Development and International Inequalities Institute. Very quick question. You said that universalism has become a bit of a dirty word on the left. What was it that turned people off the idea of internationalism?
In the idea of universalism. What turned people off in the idea of universalism? Yes.
Yeah, and but someone from the back there, the gentleman there with the beard there.
Thank you very much. Al Cisneros from Development Management. My question is the following. In developing regions such as Latin America, failed socialist projects named Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua are discursively weaponized by the oligarchy to preserve a status quo defined by colonial legacy and extractive capitalism. So my question is, how to build this citizenship of philosophers in highly unequal region, where even portions of the working class have internalized the phobias and the agenda of the elite?
Thank you. And the lady right at the front here. No, please, because people have to hear you and not hear. Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Diane Elson, Emeritus Professor, University of Essex. Really interesting, lots of things to unpack. I wanted to pick on you rightly said that human dignity is undermined by capitalism, but I was very uneasy with this very Kantian linking of human dignity with the capacity for rational self-determination. Many feminists have been very uneasy about this and have said what we need is an ethics of care that recognizes that some people will never have that capacity for rational self-determination because of various accidents of illness or birth or whatever. So does that mean they're worthless? Should we be rooting people's worth in notions of rational self-determination?
Thank you for your questions are all very big, but you did keep them short. So
Yeah, great. I will try to keep the answers also equally short. Maybe I start with the third one because it's the one that I can be briefest, in part because I think there is a kind of big misunderstanding, and forgive me if I go into Kantianese language here, but there is a big misunderstanding of what the rational subject is and a conflation between the rational subject and the individual here and now. I think if you think about the formulation of the categorical imperative is think about humanity in your person. Humanity is not the same as the individual. It's not the same as the concrete contingent individual. And it seems to me that if we think about humanity in this more capacious way, and we think about what we are capable of, even though in contingent circumstances we might be disabled, we might be ill, it's the respect for humanity that then connects this concern with care that you have with the rational self-determination. So I think that objection, although it's a really important one and one that needs to be taken very, very seriously, can be circumscribed if one thinks about humanity in a more capacious way than the kind of liberal individual subject in the way in which it's been mostly reduced when that tradition has been appropriated. I think first question, and I'll go to the first question, then I end with the third, with the middle one, because in part connected this question of universalism. This is where I'm trying to go with this discussion of the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment in its inception was a subversive project. It was a project of resistance to authority. And then because of contingent and political historical developments, when it becomes the project of a set of institutions, the French Revolution, but then from then on, the project of the liberal state as we know it, then I think the Enlightenment, this core subversive element of the Enlightenment gets appropriated and turned into an ideology of colonialism and imperialism, and then in the name of which we then know the subjugation of entire parts of the world was also conducted. So it seems to me that this resistance to universalism that we now see from post-colonial quarters, from many areas of progressive thinking, which are uneasy with this universalism of the Enlightenment, really needs to return to this core distinction between the spirit of the project and what it was at the beginning, what it represented, this fundamental anti-authoritarianism, and the appropriation of that project by particular institutions in a way that is not entirely separate, and this is where I'd really want to build, I didn't have time to go, is not entirely separate from the development of capitalism. So it seems to me that we then can't just criticize liberalism without criticizing liberal capitalism. And if we criticize liberal capitalism, then we'll have resources to read the Enlightenment in a much more different, in a more critical way. That's a sort of short answer. Third, so the middle answer about, the Stodia law, what is to be done? So what should we do? This is usually the part of the talk where I say, as in the life of Brian, I'm not the Messiah, just a naughty boy, just a naughty girl. Basically, I think
that was his mother that said that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. In the same of the spirit of the mother, where she says he's not. Just to say that I think there isn't an easy answer for how people who have developed a certain kind of consciousness are habituated in certain patterns of thinking, which are the result of this whole ideological work that we've been talking about. There isn't a magic formula for how you can convert someone from there to being someone who suddenly realizes what is in their rational self-interest. And so it seems to me that this position that we're at now, where a Mexican Amazon worker, an American Amazon worker thinks he has much more in common with Jeff Bezos than with a Mexican counterpart, because he thinks that he's taking the jobs. And so that is just pure, simple ideology of the kind that Marxists have written about at length. And there is no answer to that other than this is a political project, and there is no way around it. And in part, what I've been trying to suggest here is this is why, and perhaps this is what Amartya's reflections were also indicating, this is where ideas are really important, and the work of ideas that then turns into institutions is also really important.
Thank you. Amartya, would you like to say anything on those questions?
No, I won't be here. I won't be here.
All right. So I think given the shortness of time, I'm just going to take two. The right back over there, please.
Hello, thank you for the great session. My question is for.
Could you give your name, please?
My name is Jayant. I'm an LSE alumni, currently working as a health economist. My question is to Professor Amartya. I just wanted to understand from you, how can the idea of moral socialism strengthen democracies and help countries, and when I say countries, I mean post-colonial countries like India, decolonize institutional power to achieve social and welfare reforms? And what, according to you, is the way forward for countries like India to sort of take on board the various ideologies, and how do you see that pan out in the current times?
Thank you. And just one more. It's just here at the front. And with real apologies that so many of you wanted to ask questions. So did I, actually, but please go ahead.
I'm glad that I have the opportunity. I'm Victoria Esker. I study socioeconomics in University of Duisburg-Essen, and I also work for the Wuppertal Institute. And I really think it's interesting to connect all of the ideas that are behind those big names, like idols to me, that are sitting on the panel, having also Nicholas Stern, that is coming from environmental movement, from eco-social policies. That is a big branch I'm super interested in. And I also think it's super interesting to think of the capabilities approach as something that can be useful in order to connect the question, how do we do those policies? Yeah. Sorry. can we connect all of those three ideas of like moral socialism that is like not thinking sustainability politics in terms of like SDGs and climate goals and goal setting, and then not missing targets, not having like the complexity, but then use moral socialism and the idea of thinking together as a tool to not go with Martin Nussbaum's interpretation of the capabilities approach, but then be able to have the discussion that we need to really define like wants and needs and to live within the consumption corridors.
Thank you. Now perhaps Amartya, the first question was directed to you, and then we'll ask you, Lea, to round off on the last one. Amartya,
You know,
sorting out India doesn't take long.
everything fails, and I don't hear very well either. So I'm afraid I'm not sure that I fully understood it. But if I understood it, can you explain?
I only a little bit. It was about taking the ideas into Indian development and Indian society, and how does it guide us for ways forward in India? Excuse me if I garbled it, but how do these ideas help us think about what India should do next?
What India should do next? That seems like a grander question. But I took it to be decolonization being one of the factors that you were commenting on. And I think the history of Indian industries has something very important to teach on that, because at the time when the British arrived in India, there's considerable evidence that the standard of living different between India and Britain was not very large. In fact, it's not clear at all which direction could have gone. There have been several studies of that. So what happened, I think, after the decline of trade was a factor, big factor, that the becoming not a textile producer, but producing tea and, and other raw materials. So I think there the lesson is a pro-capitalist, anti-imperial lesson, namely lots more to be done in terms of traditional things in India. I think I take this opportunity, I'm being an opportunist in the sense that since I was commenting on Marx earlier, I would link it up. One of the neglected works of Marx is on that subject, namely in the Herald Tribune, in the 1860, about why India, what India should think about. And it takes on from the greatness of many of the ideas, and it's almost like Dalrymple's new book on the Golden Gate, and that every good thing happened in India initially. On the other hand, he thinks if that's the case, Marx asks the question, why are these people who did so many intelligent things bend their knees to monkeys and cows? What happened? And there Marx says gives the only place I've seen a pro-imperial argument, namely the British who might do something good in India. This is Karl Marx. However, what I think Marx overlooked there is that you don't have to have an empire in order to have this contact. Japan didn't, and those parts of India which did not fall for what I see as an Indian Malay, like Kerala, and they had not only local maths and science, but they also had, Jews came there the first century, Christians came there in the third century, Muslims came there in the 8th century, Parsis came there from the 9th century onward, Baha'is came there in the 19th century. So I think the decolonization had to take the form of a much broader thing, not a kind of nationalism which just rejects the British Empire, but the basic question that Marx asked, namely, do countries need dialogue with other places to understand what's happening? And that's really quite central. Yesterday, I was mentioning 1868, the first printed book on the world in China, the Diamond Sutra. And if you think about that, the Diamond Sutra, Vajrapad Chedika Padna Paramita Sutra, it's a Sanskrit book translated by a Turkmenistan guy called Kumar Jiva in 401, and then in 868 it was into Chinese printing, and its influences also at that time Korea and Japan. So it's that world, and I come back to Lea's idea, the moral sense socialism, it's also a global idea. And that's really one of the most important things. The empire doesn't do much for that. And so decolonization is important. I've got so much to say about India in the future. I won't take it in big form, but are we in a pretty bad way? The answer is yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Last words briefly, Lea.
Yeah, maybe actually I start with this idea of moral socialism as being a global idea, because it's something that's very important and that I only mentioned briefly, and it connects in part to one of the criticisms that Amartya was suggesting, that connects to this discussion around the social contract. I think one of the most productive interpretations of the social contract as a tradition and as a sort of thought experiment is to think of it as, what do we have in common as a human species, as humans? And another sort of very productive thought that also emerges from this Kantian line of thinking is that usually we, as private contract, then you have public contract, then you have international contract, then you have a sort of global settlement, but never something that is institutionally defined. And one of the most interesting things in this Kantian line of thinking is that actually these are not, stacked up on each other like little IKEA boxes. So you don't have private right and then public right and then international right and then cosmopolitan right. What Kant says is that all these types of right, and this is the productivity of the contract as a thought, are interdependent, such that if one of them is not in place, all the other collapses. And that thought, if you think about it, is really revolutionary when you think about private property. What is private property? What is mine and yours? If we don't know, what does it mean to live and to be with other people in this community of human beings? And we only know what private right is if we have figured out all these other layers. Now, that will, and then I really wrap up this, connecting to the question that was asked earlier about how do we connect all this? We have all these figures, often problematic figures with these colonial imperial tendencies, with racist inclinations, and somehow they are also part of the canon. We can't completely exclude them. We can incorporate them with some ambiguity, as Hegel had this famous sentence where he said, no one is a hero before their waiter, because they have all these problematic histories. Marx maybe was not a racist, but he was not particularly nice to women. So there's all these different complex biographies that we need to factor into our thinking. The point of this exercise is not to take one thinker, take Kant or take Marx, and then, which is unfortunately what happened in the Eastern European context that I started with, which is to glorify and deify, turn Marx into a god and replace Catholicism or Islam with this new communist religion. It's rather to have these giants on whose shoulders you sit, but that you ultimately do your own thinking for yourself. And the question there of how do we do that thinking? I don't think there is, you know, a manifesto or an answer that will tell us this is what needs to be done at the level of policy, at the level of politics. All of us, each of us in their social obligations, take this critical insight, internalizes it, and thinks about what they can do with it in the social context in which they operate. And ultimately, I think when change happens, it's from the coming together of all these different perspectives and from this critical insight that takes hold of every individual as they go about in the spontaneous order that Hayek wanted, but with a different mission from the one that Hayek had in mind.
Thank you, Lea. Thank you so much. All of us are going to go away and think about what you and Amartya have said, and I'm having to sort of suppress my own questions, but I felt that understanding, respecting, and celebrating common humanity ran right through what you and Amartya were saying. I mean, it's much more than that, but that was notion of who we are and what we owe each other. Can I apologize to those online because of the shortness of time? We couldn't take questions from there, but I'm sure that you enjoyed yourself. We certainly did, those of us who were here. And I also would like to, before I ask you to thank Lea and Amartya, could I ask you to stay in your places whilst we move off the stage so that the exit is seemly and dignified? We wouldn't want to be other than that. But most of all, I wanted to say that we've had a special treat this evening, and a good day for an academic is if she or he understands something better. Even better than that is if you go away with all sorts of puzzles and ideas to think about, and you gave us that in absolutely full measure. As I said, it was a real treat. So thank you, Lea. Thank you, Amartya, and as you said, and Mary also. Ava would have loved to have been here and would have celebrated what we've just had along with everybody else. So can I ask you to say thank you very much?